Okay, we're up to 23. Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Chris Lindgren. I'm with Mass Bio. Thanks for coming today. Today's forum is brought to you by our MedTech and Digital Health Working Group. I want to thank our co-chairs and our speakers for their generosity, and also to thank Foundation Medicine, who played a big role in helping to do the planning for this forum. Our moderator today is Paul Hartung. Paul is a MassConnect mentor and serves on the board of LUCO, Seminex, and MDG. With that, I turn it over to Paul for introductions and the panel discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Mass Bio, for inviting me to moderate this session. It's an important one. We've got a terrific set of panelists. The way this is going to work is we're going to use the Q&A function to post questions after the panelists speak. So we're not going to have any verbal questions. I will pick up questions, and unfortunately, we're probably not going to be able to get to all of them and direct them to the individual panelists. But this program is all about companion diagnostics, and as you may or may not know, companion diagnostics are tools that are employed to identify those patients who are most likely to benefit from a particular therapeutic product and highlight those who are at increased risk for serious side effects. And also they're used to monitor treatment response. This is a field that involves a lot of partnership. There's typically partnerships between one or more companies to be able to deliver on both a diagnostic and a treatment. We've got people across the ecosystem represented on the panel. We're going to try to tell the story from conception through commercialization. And we're going to start off with sort of discovery and development. And our first speaker is going to be Benoit Destinave. And Benoit is Executive Director and Head of Biomarkers and Companion Diagnostics at H3 Biomedicine. So Benoit, welcome.
Thank you, Paul. So it's a pleasure to be here, and hope everything will work out. Kind of first time I'm doing this type of thing over a video conference, although we do have meetings regularly, but this type of kind of symposium that way. So hopefully everything will be okay. So yeah, I've been working in this field for 15 years now, over different therapeutic areas. I'm currently working exclusively in oncology, where at H3, my group is essentially responsible for all the clinical translational aspects all the way to CDX development. And so when looking at CDX and biomarkers and diagnostics in general, usually the challenge we have is that initially, either you are potentially looking to confirm or take some markers coming from the preclinical space and confirm them in patients, but also there is a significant other part of the activity, which is potentially discovering other markers. So there, initially the technologies and tools we use are tools that in principle focus on a broad set of markers. In most cases, we are doing these analyses retrospectively. So there's less of a challenge than we're doing prospective testing, both in terms of timelines, logistics, but even regulatory concerns. And as you move through your clinical development, that set of markers becomes more focused, and ultimately you potentially move to a prospective phase, which is not necessarily your pivotal study phase, but potentially you have a marker which you think is robust enough and want to confirm. In this case, some of the challenges are clearly meeting regulatory needs and regulatory constraints to be able to do this, as well as being able to meet the timelines for testing prospectively. And there's often significant challenges and pushback from internal operational groups and even investigators in terms of having tests that are able to turn around quickly. Very regularly, now I get the comment, 2 weeks, this is too much. Sure Jessica will be able to talk about that as well. So we're getting constantly that pushback and about the test turnaround time and the ability to implement this. And that is a significant potential hurdle in implementing and ultimately developing CDXs to support clinical studies. Something that is really important as you're going through that whole continuum of getting these assays that are, I would say, potentially more and more focused, because I think NGS in some ways has kind of broken that perspective where you're screening wide and then ultimately focusing just on a few markers. But one thing that is important that I've learned from experience is that really, even from the beginning, always think about your line of sight to a diagnostic. So what I mean by line of sight is when you're starting testing initially, and even if you have no idea that a biomarker is ultimately going to be needed, think about the assay choices you have, the technology choices you have, and how that potentially relates to ultimately a diagnostic. Some technologies will not be able to be used as a diagnostic down the line. And there may be very valid reasons for choosing them, but keep that in mind. Ask yourself the question, because sometimes you find yourself where you've done a large part of your clinical development, identified a marker, even tested it prospectively with a certain technology, and then when the time comes to move to a diagnostic, some people are like, oh, this technology cannot be used as a diagnostic. So that means there's a major development that's required, potentially significant delays to your clinical studies. So yeah, think about that. Also something that you were relating to around partnerships that is important to understand is that you have the diagnostic partner and the pharma partner. And first and foremost, one of the biggest challenges we have is aligning both our timelines in terms of what is needed to be done and when. But also there is something to understand is that we potentially have different perspectives and different needs. For example, particularly from a pharma perspective, we're essentially looking for two things. And that's, pharma, biotech, drug developers' perspective, I think would be more appropriate. One, in terms of a diagnostic, a companion diagnostic, we're looking for I would say, a test that is robust enough to meet regulatory needs. That's the first step, and essentially that's during your development. Afterwards, and Jane will talk about this a bit more as well as Jessica, something you have to think about is transition to a commercial test, because these are two very different worlds. Essentially, to support your clinical development, one test is sufficient because you're controlling everything. You're running this through a limited set of either CROs or specific labs. But the commercial world is very different. Different territories will need different products to support this. So then there is a need for you as a pharma partner to expand these options based on what the needs are for different regions. In some ways, that's contrary to kind of what the diagnostic guys want, i.e. they want one test and their test to be used by everybody everywhere. That's not necessarily completely fair with the diagnostic people, but ultimately, that's kind of some of the push-pull you are getting in terms of these discussions with the partners you're talking to. Another important aspect in terms of diagnostics is keep it simple. I think, again, here from a pharma perspective, the diagnostic should not be a blocker to ultimately the development of your drug. So my recommendation is definitely, do not go with novel technology unless you need it. And by novel technology, I mean, technology that hasn't been through regulatory review. In some cases, you need to, and that's where you get these kind of paradigm shifts or leaps, because there is no other way around it. But science and technology is fun, but here the aim is to bring a drug to patients. And there are already sufficient hurdles that we have to go through as drug developers that you don't want to add complication throughout the way. And to answer one of your questions as well, Paul, around partnerships and maybe give you the pharma perspective in terms of what we're looking for. First and foremost, definitely we are looking for partners that have the technical capability to run the type of test we need them to run. But there are a number of other aspects which we take into account. So there's of course cost, but costs are often negotiable and can be, arrangements can be found in terms of how that cost is spread. There are other aspects in terms of the experience that a partner has in terms of going through the regulatory processes in territories you want them to go through. Different companies will have different needs. A global company will need a partner that has experience everywhere, or in most of the major territories. We're also often looking at their stability and viability. So potentially there's far more risk with a small company that's got, few, like 50, 60 employees, rather than a company that's got, that's large, that's been there for a number of years. There's also the aspect of how collaborative they are. And that's why often you will see that that drug developers have a tendency of going back to partners they've worked with previously if that collaboration has been successful, because it works. You they have a way of working that fits with your needs. So yeah, in a nutshell, I think I'm about that's about it.
Great, thank you very much. I'm sure there's going to be more discussion around the partnering issue later on. So the next in line is Elif Sola, who's CEO of Cipher Medicine, and there are lots of stories he could tell, in building a company and taking terrific science and turning it into a product. But I think you're going to focus kind of on the payer relationship.
Great, thank you so much, Paul. Just a few words about Cipher Medicine for those of you who aren't familiar with what we do. We develop diagnostic tests that predicts response to existing drugs in the market. So we focus on large blockbuster therapies that are very expensive to the healthcare system, but for which the response rates are very low, and for which there are alternative approved drugs that can be prescribed. So we're developing a host of what we like to call complementary diagnostics as opposed to companion diagnostics, because these tests weren't developed in conjunction with the drug originally. But with that in mind, obviously the landscape of getting a early stage diagnostic company funded has changed rather dramatically in the last 3 to 4 years, and it is changing very rapidly with obviously the advent of COVID-19. I'll talk about COVID-19 at the end. But what's driven this, I would say, increased level of investment into diagnostic companies has been companies starting to collaborate and cooperate early on with payers. I think if you go back maybe 10, 15 years in time, there were a lot of diagnostic tests that came into the market with very little payer or clinical adoption. And a big reason for that was that companies were taking cool technology, developing cool products, then put it into the market just to experience that the market wasn't really interested in those products. That has shifted, right? So several diagnostic companies are now incorporating payer requirements, both in terms of what, product specifications, but also in terms of evidence development and evidence requirement, which, as many of you know, is incredibly important when it comes to private payer coverage, but also Medicare coverage. And for us specifically, when we went out about 2.5 years and literally asked the payer market what they wanted in terms of which drug to go after and develop diagnostic tests, we were specifically told to stay away from oncology and instead focus on autoimmune disease, where there's very few diagnostic solutions, but where we have the most expensive drugs. So TNF therapy is a $33 billion a year drug class. Unfortunately, 65% of patients that are prescribed TNF therapy don't respond to the drug. So massive economic burden and clinical burden on systems. So as a result of that, we are developing a test that predicts response to TNF therapy. So picking an area of concern or a problem area for the payer is incredibly important when you then go and try to raise money. Because today, you know, we're coming from a world where there were a few companies like FMI, Guardant, and Grail that really got the lion's share of all investments, you know, dating back 5-6 years ago, to a world where a lot of more funds have gotten into, as diagnostic investments have become more and more attractive. I mean, mainly driven by Guardant's and FMI's multiples, because they've had really good exits. More and more investors have become more interested in placing bets on diagnostic companies. You have more investors, means there's more, obviously, money out there. And then you start to see some smaller checks going into more companies. And that's incredibly encouraging. And I think in addition to that, we've also seen a lot more West Coast money, particularly from Silicon Valley, going into diagnostic companies, and hasn't been only the kind of traditional life science investors that have been placing bets. So that's been very encouraging. The next kind of evolution that we see is, okay, so you're working closely with the payers, you've showed some traction, you've developed the evidence that you need to get your test reimbursed. What we're seeing now is, and this is really being led by oncology diagnostic companies, is people trying to become more than just a diagnostic company. They're trying to help payers and clinicians to act on the data that the diagnostic companies present or produce. And more thinking around the lines of an operating system that incorporates data, the molecular data sets and the clinical outcomes data sets together, presents it back to the physician, and then tracks over time whether use of this data actually increased, improved outcomes and reduced cost. And we think that's kind of the next iteration of thinking for a number of diagnostic companies. I'll end with some COVID-19, I would say, insights. The silver lining, if there is one, there aren't very many, but if there is one, obviously, is that today the whole world is talking about testing. That helps the diagnostic industry. From a regulatory point of view, it's gotten, just in the last few weeks, I wouldn't say that necessarily a lot of red tape has been ripped out, but there has been a heightened kind of awareness of that the regulatory authorities need to start to understand diagnostics, because that's how they can help and alleviate and push for more testing. And I think the second part is that we are realizing now that diagnostic technologies needs to take the forefront in medicine in order for us to figure out where to spend our healthcare dollars and how to utilize our healthcare resources. And that was a conversation only 3 months ago that was really falling on deaf ears, generally speaking. But now it's on top of everybody's minds, or many people's minds. And we think that is the silver lining for us in the industry. And we think in a post-COVID-19 world, there will be a stronger demand for diagnostic products.
Terrific. Everybody's looking for a silver lining right now. This is a tough time. I'm sure, you know, COVID-19 is impacting progress of companies, but also opening up opportunities. So the next speaker is Jessica Atkinson, and Jessica is Vice President of Biopharma Business Development at Foundation Medicine. So she really is on the front lines of partnering and is going to speak about those challenges.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. I lead the biopharma business development team here at Foundation Medicine. And in our team, actually, when we partner with biopharma, we do a lot more than just partner with them in terms of fueling their registrations with companion diagnostics and helping to support the enrollment of their trials. I like to leave the way you described the idea of this operating engine. And we share similar thinking in the fact that we also recognize the value that we bring to biopharma partners isn't just the platforms to accelerate their drug development, but it's also the data we generate from the platforms, both when we test a single clinical trial sample, but also with the patients that we reach on the clinical side of our business. And so much of our partnering is fueling innovation with therapeutic discovery and development, tapping into that database. But of course, the focus of today's conversation is the companion diagnostic piece. So that's where we'll focus today. And it actually is a really exciting time to talk about partnering in precision medicine, especially around companion diagnostics, because the field is evolving in so many interesting and exciting ways. And we're starting to see that translate to the way in which pharma wants to partner with diagnostic companies. So I'll walk through some trends that we're seeing in the marketplace or in the industry, and then how we're at least seeing that translate into biopharma partnering. And so one observation that we've made is just with regards to the complexity of this space. And so, you know, if you look around today, precision medicine, especially in oncology, looks markedly different from what it looked like even, you know, 2 or 3 or 5 years ago. There's an increased amount of complexity. There are certain diseases where you're seeing more and more emerging biomarkers. So in lung cancer specifically, there's so many different biomarkers that clinicians have an option of testing for in patients. And you're starting to see an increased number of potential biomarkers and more tumor types. So breast cancer is a great example, with PIK3CA being a recent approval that we saw just in the last few months. But you also see really novel approvals for patients where there were no options before. And so, you know, you look at things like the tumor agnostic approvals that are coming forth and have recently been approved. You look at, you know, really rare tumor types where there are new options for patients where there are none before. And just in the last week, we have a great example we can point to with the Insights approval in cholangiocarcinoma, which was a great option for patients. You also look at the biomarkers themselves, and the biomarkers themselves are increasing in complexity rapidly. You know, anything from fusions and rearrangements to combinatorial biomarkers like TMB. And of course, the TMB story has been unfolding over the last several years, with evidence mounting on TMB, patient by patient and study by study, but most recently the news that Merck released just in the last week, with Keytruda being under priority review for TMB high patients. So the landscape itself is increasing in complexity, and what that means is a couple of different things for pharma as we hear it. One is that the patients are hard to find because we're talking about rare DOs or really rare biomarkers. But also, you know, for them, they're finding themselves in a position where they have an opportunity to pursue more accelerated clinical development paths, especially if it's a novel or an underserved or unserved patient population using a novel biomarker. So I liked, Benoit, the way you were describing timelines, and we hear that a lot. And I think that's becoming an increasing consideration in a world where there are so many novel approvals coming forth that are pursuing accelerated approval paths. So we're seeing these themes translate actually to how pharma wants to partner with us in a couple of different ways. One is a trend that I think everybody has sort of observed in companion diagnostics over the last few years, and Jane, you can speak to this as well as I can, which is a shift away from the single gene mentality and shifting more towards a multi-gene, a panel approach, or in our case, of course, comprehensive genomic profiling. And, you know, we think that shift is being driven, you know, by a couple of different things. One is that, of course, these patients are really hard to find. One is that pharma recognizes that clinicians want an option where they can maximize the amount of information that comes out of a single sample for a patient in order to maximize the possibility that they can find not just an approved therapeutic, but potentially even a clinical trial that patients can enter into. And so in our minds, this is a lot of what's fueling the adoption of comprehensive genomic profiling. And pharma, you know, has expressed interest in that. Especially in a world where pharma partners are investigating novel and emerging biomarkers that aren't commonly used in clinical practice today. You know, they see a lot of value in what we call incidental findings. And so, the idea that a physician doesn't necessarily have to think about that particular novel biomarker when they order the test, but in fact, that's included in a test that they routinely order in clinical practice. And the other piece to this, I think, that's driving the shift, and Benoit, you touched on this earlier as well, this desire to maximize information out of samples when you're in discovery or development phase. And there's lots of insights you can uncover, even retrospectively, in a world where you're running samples from a clinical trial a year or 2 years ago and discovering new insights that might inform thinking for new possible options for patients. So that's the shift from, I would say, from single gene to panels. The next one that we're seeing is an increasing number of pharmas, at least in oncology, who are really excited about adopting both a tissue-based and a liquid biopsy-based approach. So, liquid biopsy is an emerging modality and a really exciting option for patients, especially for advanced cancer patients that might not be eligible for whatever reason. For genomic testing from tissue, maybe they don't have enough tissue, or there's other health reasons why they're not eligible for those types of tests. So we're really excited about the emergence of liquid biopsy to help open up the reach to more patients, and pharma is equally excited about that. And so, part of what we've done in our thinking that pharma has really resonated with our pharma partners is we're pursuing the same path with Foundation One Liquid as we've done with Foundation One CDX, which is pursuing approval of a liquid biopsy-based test to offer flexibility to pharma. And so now, when we look at our portfolio of studies that we partner with in pharma, a good part of those are actually ones where pharma is selecting liquid biopsy-based approach in complement to a tissue-based approach. And that's a really exciting direction for the field to be headed. Another trend we're seeing is just how pharma thinks about partnering. And so earlier, I talked about accelerated clinical development timelines, and Benoit, you teed that up very nicely. Pharma is in a place now where timelines are shorter than ever. And this is really exciting because it means really innovative therapeutics and medicines getting into the hands of patients faster. But importantly, you can't let a diagnostic hold that up. And we recognize that, and we hear that a lot from pharma. And so, pharma has expressed a lot of warmth or resonance with those models where, like ours, Foundation One CDX has already been brought through the agency. And in some ways, you can look at that as sort of de-risking development. And, I think that's something that pharma is of utmost concern because nobody wants to delay getting the hands of an exciting medicine into the hands of patients. And maybe the last piece to those criteria are commercial considerations. So it's interesting because when I think about the conversations I was having, 4 and 5 years ago with biopharma partners, a lot of the criteria that you heard about pharma was asking in terms of making a decision on a diagnostics partner were things like timelines and cost and turnaround time, and those things haven't gone away. Technical capabilities, regulatory capabilities, and those are all still there. But more and more, we're starting to hear the desire to understand commercial capabilities really early on in the decision-making process. And we think this is really important because you want to be sure that you're selecting a platform before you go into trials that can seamlessly transition from development all the way through to commercialization without having to make a bridging decision later, which is a risky decision to make and also is not always easy when sample is limited for patients. So we're seeing commercial stage partners bringing their commercial colleagues and thought leaders to the table really early in the discussion, which is great. And they're looking for solutions where they can really maximize reach to patients. And that resonates well with us because that's what we're all about. Our biggest goal as a company is driving the adoption of testing for patients so that they can have access to medicines that can help them. And today, I think we're reaching on average of 2,500 patients or something like that a week. And we've found that resonates really well with pharma. So these are some of the key trends that we're seeing. I think the underlying piece to all of this is that, in a world where there's new and novel indications coming forth for really niche sets of patients, and where the complexity of options is increasing rapidly and is not going to stop, finding ways to reach the patients with testing and ensuring that they have all of the options available to them from a therapeutic perspective, be it, you know, approved or a clinical trial, is critical. And we're seeing more and more pharmas appreciate the concept of having a really well thought out strategy that starts from early discovery or development with selection of a diagnostics partner, and then transitions all the way through to commercialization. I think I went over my 5 minutes, Paul, but thanks.
Well, thank you so much. And I think Jane's going to thank you because you queued her up beautifully. So Jane Lee is Senior Director of Oncology Companion Diagnostics Commercialization at Thermo Fisher Scientific. And she has some great perspectives on really how to commercialize these kind of products.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you all the panelists teeing up the excitement on the commercialization topic. Just a few words on Thermo Fisher and the division that I'm in before I dive into the topic. So you probably all know Thermo Fisher is a very large global company. We offer products for a variety of industries, life science, diagnostics, and pharmaceutical, bioprocessing, and discovery and development. So, you know, in the diagnostic field, the next generation sequencing division that I'm in particularly focus on oncology and NGS CDX. So continuing the theme that you heard from other panelists this morning. So we really started our NGS CDX program 5 years ago with a number of pharma partnerships, particularly in the non-small cell lung cancer space. So over the past 5 years, we've launched our CDX product, OncoMyDX target test, in 4 different countries. So US, Japan, Europe, and Korea. So my experience over the past 5 years is commercialization is not a global decision. It's actually a very important regional considerations as you start planning. And as Jessica mentioned, that commercialization planning or thinking is starting to move upstream. You don't wait till you submit and then start to think about the commercialization. You actually start planning for that much earlier in the development process, and sometimes at the time of the deal signing with the pharma partners. So I would say the importance of, you know, making some of the key decisions that you want the team to start thinking about during the development phase is what is the most competitive product claims you want to seek as part of the submission in the different regions. Because what we've seen in the past 4 years is with a multiplexing technology CDX like NGS, you really have different options, really good options of how you want to slice and dice your claim to be most appropriate for that particular region, for the reimbursement purpose and for the commercial testing environment that you're in. So that's one great advantage of NGS CDX. So you kind of need to strategize that, you know, ahead of time and work with your regulatory team to decide what is the best claims that you want. And sometimes it's not the same in the different regions. So I give you an example that if you look at US, you know, if you look at an NGS CDX, you can have a CDX claim and you can have a gene profiling claim, you know, the broad profiling claim. In US, I would say an NGS CDX without a broad profiling claim is not very useful to clinicians. But then if you go to Japan, it's very much CDX driven, and it's less so important how many genes you report outside the CDX. So those are the different market dynamics you want to take into consideration as you plan for the submission. So that's actually the most important decision for your product you need to make during the development. And then once you get to the submission and approval, your next big task is how to get reimbursement. Because without reimbursement, there was no economics for the laboratories to bring up the testing. So reimbursement has been, I think, the focus of the NGS industry. You know, all the different players in the past 5 years. I would say at this point, it is becoming actually very favorable in US with the NCD that's issued by CMS that grant, NGS CDx broad national Medicare coverage and the pricing. So that is a key advantage established for any future NGS CDx to come in this space. But Medicare only solves half of the problem, patient population. For the commercial payers, you still have to go one by one. But I would say Medicare is a key first step and to make your commercial payer discussion a lot easier, not completely solve it, but it definitely is advantageous. Then you switch gear to other countries like Japan. Japan is a single payer country. So MHLW is basically the one payer that matters for that country. And as we went through the different countries' reimbursement dialogue, the considerations is all very different. So you have to speak the different vocabulary or value proposition that's most appropriate for those different countries. So with MHLW, their focus is definitely more on the value of the CDX markers. That's where they put most of the pricing on. And that's the key difference from US CMS approach. So then once you solve the reimbursement coverage and obtain the pricing, the next big objection you need to remove in the market is actually on the clinician side. So, if you have reimbursement, the laboratories will get paid for running the test. But if the physicians don't order the test, then no patient is going to benefit from it. So that is a key activity that we see that's necessary in all the different regions, and it requires us to work very closely with our medical team to generate the evidence that's needed to change physician behavior. I would say that is the most challenging piece. Every region we go to, there's no shortcut. It takes time. It takes a lot of advocacy from key opinion leaders and from evidence generation to change the mind, and it doesn't happen overnight. And as Jessica mentioned that, with NGS CDX, we are going, especially in the lung indication, we are going after changing that behavior from single gene testing to NGS, because if you have 7 or 8 drugs in lung, it's just not possible to do all the single gene testing. So I would say that's an area that we are very encouraged to see a lot of pharma partners, commercial team are stepping up to lead that NGS messaging. So that's a very important trend that I've observed in the past year or so, that pharma commercial teams are becoming more explicit with an NGS messaging. NGS is the preferred way to go. And that, I think, it really helps all the diagnostic company in the NGS CDX space to really kind of all sing the same tune to the clinicians. Ultimately, the pharma commercial team have great reach to the clinicians. They have a great impact on the physician behavior. So I'll just leave it at that. Those are the key lessons we learned.
Well, thank you so much. You all provided different perspectives on the big problem of finding homes for these products and getting them to the world. So I'm very pleased to see that questions have already popped up. I know that Jeet Bharti raised a question while Benoit was speaking, so I think it's directed at you, Benoit. And he's asking about, he says, do you know a CRO that can conduct prospective studies of a predictive biomarker for a drug that's already approved? So this is about the CRO phase.
Yeah. Actually, in some ways, that would be more a question for Alif, because basically, so from a drug developer's perspective, we do, the aim is usually, well, you're usually not developing a diagnostic for a drug that's already approved, unless some further information comes back at some point where there's a need for that, i.e. those would be mainly probably safety concerns. I mean, I think it's in principle, you can go to any CRO to develop a diagnostic, but I think it depends from whose perspective you are. I guess I need more background on the question in terms of, is it the pharma company going to a CRO to develop a diagnostic for a drug that is already approved, or is it somebody else? I don't know. Alif, maybe you can give your perspective there.
Yeah, no, great question. And a very difficult one at that, right? I think the CROs have been struggling trying to figure out how to design diagnostic clinical studies for drugs that are already approved, particularly if you're going to commercialize under an LDT where you don't need FDA approval. We don't have to get into that whole conversation, but that's where we are today. As long as you run your tests from a central lab. And the challenge is that the CROs come into the project wanting to run the study as a drug trial. Basically layering all the FDA requirements on top of your study, which makes it incredibly expensive. So we've spent a great deal of time, because we are commercializing initially as an LDT, and then we're going to IVD it in a few years. We've spent a lot of times with CROs who really want to get there, meaning they really want to provide a lean and an appropriate study. But at the end of the day, they can't, because they're just sitting on so much overhead tied to FDA, right, requirements. So there are a few out there that are better than others, and my advice would be focus on the smaller ones that have made it part of their strategy to service the diagnostic industry, as opposed to focusing on the big national, international ones. I think if you're a small company, that's just going to get too expensive and be too slow. Coming back to what Benoit was talking about, time. It's one thing about obviously development time schedules, but clinical development time schedules is as much of an issue, right? So that would be my advice. Try to go small and lean and mean rather than go with one of the big, comfortable, large CROs.
Great. So while Jessica was speaking, Jeremy Bond posted a good question. If you have a platform companion diagnostics, would you prefer an exclusive deal for example, a specific indication or a specific drug partner, or would you rather maintain broad access to the platform through non-exclusive deals with multiple biotech and pharma partners?
Yeah, that's a great question, and certainly one we're not unfamiliar with. And what I would say is that we want to take whatever path gets the maximal amount of options into the hands of patients. And in our minds, limiting a particular biomarker or particular approach just to one drug when there's many different options out there that could help and serve a patient isn't in line with our mission of transforming cancer care. And when I think about at least our platform, the very value of the platform is that it's one that's already widely adopted, and the more options therapeutic options that come forth that have approvals on the platform, the more options there are for patients. And, I think our preference is really just maximizing the availability of those solutions. And it's interesting to note this question because actually we've seen a shift in thinking amongst our pharma partners in this philosophy as well. I think there was a time when pharma may say, well, we've discovered this sort of novel gene or a novel biomarker, and we sort of want to hold on to this. But what pharma's recognized is that the ability to find those patients and identify those patients in the clinical setting is only as good as wide utilization and adoption of the biomarker. And so we're starting to hear a shift in how our pharma partners talk about those scenarios, away from, well, we want to use this to sort of differentiate us, and more towards a world where they say, who else can maybe adopt this to help drive utilization in the clinic. And I think that's being reflected in a lot of our conversations.
Jane, do you want to add to this?
Maybe I can add something. I think, one of the big learnings in terms of what Jessica, at least from a pharma perspective, was this whole, I'll call it the PDL One Mess, where, each pharma company came in with different tests thinking that, theirs was better than the other. And it caused a massive issue, in my opinion, in terms of then prescribing it. And ultimately, you can't ask hospitals to run 4 different tests, essentially for the same marker here. It's even worse, it's for the same marker, because in principle, you couldn't prescribe each individual drugs unless you had run that test. So I think the world is now really flipped a bit, and is, the more you can get one test to then inform for multiple drugs, the better. Jane, sorry about that.
Yeah, Jane, did you want to add anything to this conversation?
I completely agree. I think ultimately we want to do the best for the patient. So that's how we approach any of the considerations and decisions from on the partnership. Is ultimately we want the patient to be benefited from broad use of genomic profiling.
Great. Well, since we're on the topic of partnering, I'm going to ask a question, which you probably all have perspectives on, but maybe starting with Jessica, is, what are some key factors to a successful partnership?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I think there's different ways that you can define success. Success isn't always something that reaches the goal line of approval. And sometimes there's things that change in the context of a clinical program where you don't always see that. But in our minds, successful partnerships are defined by those that are truly collaborative in nature and spirit and are almost authentic. And what I mean by that is a couple of different things. One piece is open and honest and transparent communication, and approaching the development process as a true co-development initiative, rather than something that feels like a vendor-customer relationship. And when we do that, what I've observed is a lot of open sharing from both sides about development strategies, timelines, plans. And, at the end of the day, I think it was you, Benoit, talking about how difficult it is to line up timelines. It's also difficult to line up development strategies. And if something moves over here, it can also impact what we do on the diagnostic side. And so, one key feature of those really authentic and collaborative partnerships has been just open and transparent communication. And then another feature I would say about these partnerships is a shared mindset. And I mentioned earlier, for us, our mission as a company is transforming cancer care. And developing a diagnostic, co-developing a diagnostic and a therapeutic is not easy. There are a lot of twists and turns that we encounter along the way. And what has been really helpful to help us get through that and overcome some of the challenges that are thrown our way collectively with our pharma partners is really sharing that mindset or that goal of what we're desiring to achieve and what we're driving towards. And I think when the project teams are coming together with a mutual understanding that ultimately the desire is just to get options in the hands of patients and to do something really different than what's ever been done before in the field of medicine, then I think sharing that mindset can help overcome those. I'm thinking about a lot of our partnerships that have been very long-standing, that where we've worked with partners for a long time. The most recent example was the Pemazir approval that came through, I think, just in the last few days with Insight. This was a long-standing collaboration. We co-developed a companion diagnostic alongside Insight's therapeutic, and of course it culminated in a really novel approval for patients with FGFR2 fusion or rearrangement positive cholangiocarcinoma. And we have a whole bunch of those use cases in the pipeline that we're really excited about it. But I think importantly, the partnerships that are the most successful, quote unquote, are those that have those features of a really collaborative and authentic nature.
Great. So there was a follow-up question that came from Charles Ma. Actually, he's posted a couple of questions, but I'm going to pick the first one. So how has the PDL1 situation been fixed? I think that might be playing off a comment you made, Benoit. So do you want to tackle that?
So as part of so I used to work for AstraZeneca before and was a bit involved in that. I think what ultimately happened, well, first of all, I think going back to one of the things I was saying, there's what happens when you're in development, and then there's what happens when you're in the commercial world. So one thing you need to understand is that yes, there is usually one or maybe a few approved diagnostics, but then once you get to commercialization and to the post-approval step, particularly in the IHC space, I don't know how many PDL1 IHCs you have, but you probably have hundreds, because a lot of them are homegrown LDTs developed by the labs, which caused even further complication because the level of validation is very variable. Some of them are very good, others are more iffy. In terms of the CDXs, what's happened is that it had several consequences. First of all, the drug developers in that field, Roche, BMS, Merck, AstraZeneca, sat down with the diagnostic partners. They essentially worked on what they call the blueprint study to show the correlation between these assays, and essentially demonstrated that most of them were more or less the same. It also resulted in the FDA looking at things in a different way as well, and actually pushing, and I know this, some of the things they've come up with are not necessarily, at least are still, in my opinion, it's a work in process, but more, looking, for example, at class validation, which I think, is potentially difficult, or at least the way it's planning on being implemented. But ultimately, I think, yes, we'll go more towards there. But the PDL1 story right now is, people are using different tests, but that's the reality of diagnostics in general. And also, that's one of the challenges we have as pharma companies, in that we need to ensure that the tests that are being run are quality tests, because ultimately they can impact physicians' point of view in terms of the efficacy of our drugs. So some of the aspects that you have to put in place, there are a whole lot of things that you have to put in place once your drug is commercialized. For example, probably one of the most efficient ways to control kind of this is to put in place ring testing. Ultimately, very selfishly, from a drug developer's biopharma perspective, who cares what test is used, as long as the test is a quality test and gives the proper result back. So one of the things you have to do as a biopharma company when you're in that space is really to ensure quality testing and putting in place solutions to make sure that labs that are running tests, whatever that tests are, have standards and have ways to judge the quality of their tests.
So another question from the same person, and I'm going to direct this at Alif, but it comes to the value proposition and sort of the relative value of diagnostics to drugs, basically. And has this changed? And how do you approach the value proposition in attracting investors?
Yeah, and I think maybe if I take the question a step further, why are we in a market where you can charge $100,000 for a drug, but where the market has a hard time charging, $2,000 or $3,000 for a test that predicts if a patient is going to respond to that drug or not, right? I mean, that's like a fundamental question that I think we're all kind of struggling with, right? In terms of building models, health economic models, clinical outcome models, and the data supporting it to show that it should be diagnostic first and then therapy, as opposed to therapy first and then diagnostics. But I think that's an evolution, right? So the question is, has it gotten better? Yeah, I think it's gotten a lot better. I'm not sure it's gotten better. I think diagnostic companies have had to block and tackle their way through that, using Medicare and CMS, using as one avenue, using FDA approval as another avenue. But it's quite interesting when you look at what the payer requires to really give a diagnostic test its true value, the level of evidence is oftentimes higher than what the FDA requires for approval. So payers are almost becoming the new FDA, if you will, in one aspect, in terms of setting the threshold for the evidence requirements to really get paid, right? The value of the test. So I think it's getting better, but I also think diagnostic companies are going to have to figure out ways where they become more than just a data kind of, hey, here's a data report, right? That's what I was talking about before, the operating system. I think we're moving into a world where diagnostic companies are realizing we're bringing so much more value to the system, but we're not getting paid for it. How can we claw into that value in a more in a better way, right? So it's getting better, but I think there's a lot more work to be done.
Well, I think on that note, we're kind of running out of time here. I want to take a moment to thank each one of you. It's been a very informative event. I'd like to invite Chris Lindgren. You've got an upcoming event, I know, on COVID-19 coming up. Is there anything else that you'd like to announce to the people who are in the audience?
Yeah, Friday, May 1st from 10 to 11, we have a COVID-19 Emerging Technologies and Diagnostics. And then on May 7th, we have a China forum. They're both in the morning from 8 to 9. The China one's going to be a little bit longer. And we have Brad Lonkar on the China forum. So it's really about the China biotech boom and the impact of the coronavirus. So please join us.
Well, again, thank you, everybody, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, panelists.